Hey, just going to do a quick introduction to Manhwa. So, if you're not familiar with what it is, it's graphic stories similar to manga or graphic novels. If you're not familiar with graphic novels or manga, think of it like a bigger comic book. So, what they are pictures with the text bubbles and the text boxes that are telling the story. The origination of Manhwa in Korea started around the time, or shortly after the time of the Japanese occupation in the early 1900s. So around the 1920s or 30s, I think, is when they say that the term manhwa starts getting used. But there's going to be a big explosion later on. When it first starts getting used, it's going to be things like you'd see in a magazine, a standalone picture that's maybe pointing out something about society or the government or something like that, or maybe a little bit bigger, like you might see in the comics section of the newspaper. But then in the 50s and 60s, we're going to see a big explosion in Korea. There's going to be a lot of more manga magazines, similar. So the manhwa magazines are going to be very similar to the manga magazines in Japan. It's going to be a collection of different pieces of stories or whole stories. You're going to have your manhwa cafes. You're going to have manhwa books being published. So there's going to be this explosion. You can imagine if there's going to be cafes dedicated to reading manhwa, there must be a considerable amount of it being published. So manhwa, it's very varied in its styles, its content. Much like manga, you can find manhwa that is geared towards little kids, stuff that's geared towards adults. Comedic stories, your big action epics, memoirs, biographies, historical pieces, you name it. So as many styles as you can imagine are going to exist out there. In fact, there's even manhwa that's specifically made for online reading, which is actually formatted differently than the print manhwa. It looks a little different. It's more likely to be in color than the printed stuff, which is black and white. So, how is manga different than manhwa? And at first glance, you're looking here, the top three are manga images that I've pulled from some of my favorite manga artists. The bottom three are some manhwa images I pulled from 3 exceptional stories. And at first glance, you might say that there really isn't much difference. If you look at the manga at the top there, we've got Junji Ito's Frankenstein, an award-winning story. Junji Ito is a master of the horror story. If you ever want to pick up any of his stuff, I'd highly recommend Shiver. And then Frankenstein is also very good. He's other stories that are just phenomenal. His standalone books are also great, as well as his collections of short stories like Frankenstein and Shiver. Barefoot Gen, a memoir story of surviving the atomic bomb. And then we've got Mizuki's Showa series. Big fan of Mizuki. He's known for the simple character drawing, but then just detailed background that looks like a photograph, but he drew them by hand. So looking at these, you can see the style difference between these three. Looking down the bottom, you can see the manhwa stories. We've got From Grass. In the middle, we've got Uncomfortably Happily. And then on the end here, your far right, you'll see Banned Book Club. Both exceptional stories, standalones. And you can see, like, there are some similarities as far as the characters looking somewhat simplified. We've got a variety of backgrounds that can be detailed, simple, but there are some differences when you look at them a little more in depth. So one thing that makes manhwa a lot easier to read for American readers is it goes from left to right. If you've tried to read manga, you got to kind of get your brain used to going right to left. You got to even just turning the book over from how you normally want to hold it and open it to the other side. So it takes a little getting used to. Manhwa is done in the same way as an American graphic novel. Left to right, the cover is where you would expect it to be. You open up the book the way you expect, and you go through it. Manga is very popular in the United States. Manhwa is starting to kind of get through the door. So it's not as popular yet, but in the last couple of years, there have been several titles that have been published that are really, really good, worth looking at. Another big difference that I'll point out is there are a lot of outside of Japan manga artists and manga books. We have American manga. There's, I believe, Australian manga. You can find all sorts of manga being created outside of Japan. But manhwa, it's a little less so. A lot of the manhwa artists in the United States that are making stuff, the Korean artists, they're not being labeled as manhwa. It's being labeled as just graphic novels or comics or comic books or whatever, even though there have been Korean manhwa artists that have come to the United States and worked on, I believe, Marvel, for example. So we don't apply the title manhwa. It's not as well known. But if you're familiar with manga, you'll find a lot of similarities and some differences as you look through. So just to give you some examples here, I said there have been some great manhwa published in English recently. My top picks here, I love Uncomfortably Happily. It's a memoir about a little over a year, this young couple living on top of a mountain. Well, youngish. Grass, phenomenal, bit depressing, but a phenomenal read about someone who interviews one of the comfort women that survived being taken from Korea by Japan and being used for prostitution. Bit of a darker story, but just a phenomenal, phenomenal read. Banned Book Club. This is probably the shortest book on this entire list. It's great. It has to do with a time of censorship in Korea, one of many, and the author includes some fiction and kind of combines some characters together, some real people together to make a single character for the flow of the story, things like that. But for the most part, it's memoir. Only maybe 200 pages tops. So it's a quick read, very good. Bad Friends, another one that's a bit dark, but really gives you an idea of what it's like to be a teenager in Korea and how similar that is to being a teenager in America and how your choices can lead to different futures. The same artist who did Bad Friends did one called 19, which was just released around the start of the 2020 school year, 2020-2021 school year. Uma's Table is realistic fiction. We have some characters that are animals that are very human-like, but really the focus is on how food can bring family together and help you deal with the loss of someone. If you've had to deal with a death in the family, and you might find some things in this book that would be very similar, very easy to connect to. And then Moms, probably not one you'd want to use in a classroom, but kind of what it's like to be the mother of a grown child. Still very much a child as you read the story, but in his 20s, and this woman who sacrificed her life essentially for her kids, for her family, now as a much older adult, is looking to try and find love and happiness in her life, despite dealing with slime balls and horrible people. So there's definitely a lot of sex in that book. You don't see a lot of it, but it's there, so probably not great for school. But it's still a good read if a little dark. So some books to look at. Like I said, you will see a lot of similarities to manga if you're very familiar with manga, but there are differences. Being it that it's developed in Korea being occupied by Japan, and so close to Japan, there's going to be a lot of influences, A lot of similarities, but it will have its own flavor, its own voice. So I hope that gives you a little introduction.